Well, first of all, Hannah, I would like to welcome you to Fellowship in Fairy Dust,
Thank
and it's a
you.
pleasure to have you on. So you've been involved in some really exciting things recently. This is
Yes.
your debut novel, entitled A Lady, and it deals with the American Revolution, which is a period near and dear to my heart. So,
Mm,
it's wonderful to see someone else working in that time period because it's
mm,
kind of rare. I mean,
mhm.
I guess one of the first things I'd like to ask is that have you noticed what I've noticed that strangely enough, one would think, at least in America, it would be more of a popular time period for historical fiction writers to take
Mm,
up. But at
mhm.
least from my experience, it seems rather rare. Have you noticed this as well? Or like what has been your experience, I suppose, within that, for lack of a better
Yeah.
word, fandom, you know?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. That's a great question. And a good point to make. Yeah, I think, being in the realm of historical fiction, so often you'll ask other authors or readers what their favorite time period is. And I think the most popular answers are usually World War II.
Yeah.
And I think, part of that has to do with at least our generation and older has a bit of a personal connection to it.
Mm.
My both of my grandfathers fought in World War II. And so there's that connection of growing up with the stories from our parents, from our grandfathers, and that sort of thing. um and so I think that might be why. But anything previous to that really is, I think other than that, it would be Civil War, is more popular. But
I've
when
observed
it,
that as well. Civil
yeah,
War
yeah,
I think you're right. It's World War II and then Civil War in terms of just
hmm,
sheer popularity. And when you go to any
hmm,
kind of like historical fiction section of bookstore, I mean,
yeah,
yeah, I kind of wonder if that started like all the way back with Gone with the Wind and then just sort of
mm,
proliferated from there. But there really is a
yes.
like huge amount of it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I've found, I'm not sure if you found it too with sharing about our books that are set during the American Revolutionary War. Um, so many times I have to almost edit how I like my word choice
Hmm.
in telling others about my book. And sometimes I'll try to say like, oh, it was a British woman who fought for George Washington during the American Revolutionary War.
Hmm.
But so often I'll get to George Washington and then their eyes have glazed over because they don't even know who that is.
Yeah,
Um,
I can
or
see why you would aim for that though, because you're trying
yeah,
to kind of pick a famous name, sort of name drop a little bit to gear
exactly.
people in on something. But you're
Yeah.
right. There is a tendency that even with like a famous name like that, they'll just kind of
Mhm.
start to lose interest because
Yeah.
I guess you're right. It does have to do with I don't know, I suppose distance. But then again, now
Mm.
that I think about it, I feel like the Tudors are more popular.
Oh,
So
very much so. Mhm.
exactly. So in other words, it maybe it's not just the distance. It's just a
Mm.
weird, like for example, I feel like there's a jump
Mm.
where I've noticed that when trying to pitch mine, I'll go to groups that deal with the Regency because I'm like,
Mm.
well, technically this is the Georgian era. I mean, anything
Yeah.
that deals with the King Georges, all four
Yeah.
of them, um,
Mm.
should be kind of, interconnected in people's
Yeah.
minds, but I notice it's not. So in a
Mhm.
lot of people's minds, they really do focus on Jane Austen type of stuff, and that is
Mhm.
very much within a particular
Mm.
Regency, you know, uh, period, and
Yeah.
sometimes those people, interestingly enough, don't even really take in like Napoleonic Wars, even though it's
Yeah.
the exact same time period, but they
Yeah.
don't. It's like
Yeah.
it's not like, we want a particular like subgenre within that subgenre. So it's very
Mm.
tricky. So I,
Yeah.
I really relate, and I feel like there is a jump between
Mm.
the Tudors, which get attention,
Mm.
and then all of a sudden the Regency period, and there's this whole
Yeah.
in between zone that gets skipped.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think it's something that you know, could either be incredibly frustrating of, you know, like, come on, guys, like, especially for us Americans, you know, we
Yeah.
should know our origins, we should know our history. You know, that's something that's very valuable. You know, I believe it's important to know your past and what you stand upon in order to build your future. But I think it's also a very exciting opportunity for us with our books to reintroduce them to the past and to you know, to put flesh upon it. And you know, something I've brought up to some people that I've shared who are not really interested in early American history, is that there's this preconceived notion that the American Revolutionary War, apart from like the storytelling of Hamilton the musical,
Right.
there's this notion of it being all about these old white men in wigs. And, you know, if you think about it, it's like, well, like George Washington himself, like during the war, actually wasn't that old.
No,
You know,
no,
he
I
was
think,
40s,
yeah.
50s. And then, you know, pretty much everyone else was our generation, our age group. And, you know, you think about Marquis de Lafayette, and he was 19 and
Yeah,
then,
he's
you know,
so
into
young.
his 20s. So, you know, I try to reveal how relatable it is, you know, of these people were dealing with tumultuous times, and they were dealing with the struggle of their current reality and then their desires for the future for themselves, but also for their families. And I think those are things we can relate to nowadays as well. So I think, you know, as
Sure.
we expose those themes in our stories, you know, we can help ignite more of an interest for that time period.
Absolutely. And I think you're right about the fact that people do sometimes, in part because of the wigs, actually, I think,
Yeah.
funnily enough, the kind of material culture element of it, of the powdered wigs,
Mm,
makes people think a lot of people were older than they were.
mm.
Because there's the association of the sort of white hair kind of
Yeah,
vibe.
yeah.
And you know, that of course, you know, wasn't the case. But it was basically a combination of a fashion style and a pragmatic thing, in terms
Exactly.
of hair cleanliness and whatnot.
Mm, mhm.
So because, well, it is very interesting actually, because I'm a big fan of General James Wolfe, from the French
Mm,
and Indian War,
mm.
and one of his kind of famous things was is that he didn't like wigs. He
Yeah,
didn't care that they were the fashion. He thought, no, I don't
yeah.
like them. I'm not into them. I don't like to crop my hair, and he had very
Mm,
identifiably tawny red hair.
mm,
He's like, I don't like to crop it short. I don't like to deal with the wigs. I don't like them. They're a pain.
mm.
I'm gonna just wear my hair regular, and
Yeah,
you know, to heck with the rest of the world that doesn't like my fashion style and my
right.
sense. And so he got famously branded as the red-headed corporal. It became kind of his thing because
Mm,
he wouldn't cover his hair,
mhm.
and he wasn't. Frankly, he wasn't the only one who wouldn't. There were definitely
Yeah.
people who didn't cover their hair. I mean,
Mhm.
plenty of people who obviously just couldn't afford wigs.
Yeah,
So there were
yeah.
whole classes of people who were not doing that.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
but then even those who could sometimes didn't because they just chose it.
Mhm.
And we do
Yeah.
have various paintings of people who are not wearing wigs all the time, and they do seem like they're
Mm,
wearing their hair at length, which was the
mhm,
style.
mhm.
And then sometimes there was another whole thing, which was powdering your hair. So
Yeah.
your actual hair. So it wasn't always the
Mhm.
wigs. So you have all this
Yeah.
material culture, but I do think that it lends just a tendency for people to assume they
Mm,
were older than they were because of the styles.
mhm.
So
Yeah.
I think that's another thing that puts it at this distance, or
Mm.
people find it looks goofy. That's another thing which I notice
Yeah.
people, whether it's whether it's like the American Revolution, sort of French Indian
Mm,
War time period, or even further back, like once you
mm.
get back to, for example, the early 1700s, which I have
Yeah.
an interest in as well. And you're dealing with,
Oh,
for
yeah.
example, the types of wigs you see with like the Duke of Marlborough and stuff. It's
Mm.
very different looking to what
Mhm.
modern expectations of what men would be wearing
Yeah.
are alike. So
Yeah.
therefore there's a tendency for it to be treated as goofy guys in
Mhm.
weird wigs. The
Mhm.
fashion sort of actually takes people out of it in some way
Yeah.
and makes it hard for them to relate, which I find funny, and I find it lacks
Yeah.
a little bit of imagination on the part of some people that they could imagine
Yes.
different styles. But it is. I
Mhm.
notice I do think that the material culture distances people a little bit more than
Mm.
say the Civil War, the American
Yeah.
Civil War. So
Yeah.
that's what I think might contribute as
Mhm.
well.
Yeah, that's a good point for sure. Mhm.
But I definitely think you're right about the whole thing regarding remembering that people in the time periods, there were whole mixes of age groups involved, and obviously
Mhm.
most soldiers on either side were quite young. The
Mhm.
ages you'd be, going into the army or volunteering to participate in the revolution would have been really in your teens and early 20s.
Mhm.
So that's, a whole, demographic of people
Mhm.
who, again, as you say, are not old white men in
Yeah.
wigs thing. That's just not, what it was. So you get so many different people who, again, were, in our general age range. And
Mm.
that is something that, bringing that more to light. And as you say, the outcomes of the war were going to, affect them or, their
Mhm.
generation and so forth, because of the fact
Mhm.
that they definitely, in many cases, were starting out in
Yeah.
life in different ways.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's definitely
Mhm.
fascinating. And even those who weren't starting out like immediately in life,
Mhm.
still, it wasn't like they were death warmed over, which
Yeah.
again is the preconception, and it just wasn't. So I think
Mhm.
you're absolutely right.
Mm.
Um, so tell me, how did you like first get interested in the time period? Was there any like specific things that like you remember as a child or whatnot that really
Mm.
got you onto that particular era, or did it just sort of happen? You don't remember the origin point?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I kind of grew up a history buff. My father loves history. He's always been reading various biographies, and has read a lot, during American Revolutionary time. Um, and he also shared a lot of family history. And so that just sparked a deep respect and interest
Mhm.
in the past and what we can learn from it. Um, and then from there, I spent a lot of time with my mom enjoying, British history, enjoying Jane Austen, Charles
Mhm.
Dickens, and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, I was one of those people who really enjoyed the
Yeah.
Regency. I still do. Um, but then it was, let's see, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Um, Ron Chernow, he did the biography of Hamilton that
Mhm.
sparked the musical.
Oh,
Well,
interesting.
he
Okay.
also did a biography of George Washington.
Mhm.
And my dad had it. He let me borrow it, and it's about like this thick.
Oh, geez, yeah.
So it took some
Big
time.
read to read, right?
Yes, but I just remember being so inspired by the man that he was, and just the intricacies of his character, where he put off quite a stoic image, not only to most people around him, but to history itself
Mhm.
and the memory of him. But when you get more into the accounts of those who knew him intimately, you see how vulnerable he was and how deeply he felt,
Mhm.
and how so many things throughout the war, throughout the politics, after the war, throughout being president, all of that impacted him so profoundly. um, and so I found that very inspirational. It really just brought him to life for me. And the amount of detail that biography had was just fascinating, as far
Mhm.
as all the different elements of the war and the descriptions of the battles and that sort of thing. So I think that really was the starting point.
Mhm.
And from there it just continued to build and compound into a bit of an obsession now.
Oh yeah, no, I totally relate, and I think I very much like you. My dad is big on history as well, so he very
Mm,
much raised me in that kind of thing,
mm,
watching documentaries, reading books
yeah.
and everything else. He grew up in Fort Lee, New Jersey, so
Mm,
it's right around a lot of American Revolution history. So he would take
mm,
me up on the bluffs and things like that.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, where you get all this sort of Washington, Cornwallis chasing each other,
Mm, yeah.
or Cornwallis chasing, Washington trying to, elude
Yeah.
the pursuit. So you get all of that. But yeah, no, I think that you're right about as well, like Washington and a bunch of other characters. That again, there's this sort of popular
Mm,
conception of them being very emotionless,
mm,
if you will, and
mhm,
stoic, and they were stoic. But I think the thing is that there's a difference between just a kind of stoicism without the emotion
mhm.
versus a stoicism that shields emotion, but there's actually a
Yes.
lot going on inside.
Yes. Mhm,
So, I mean, that's definitely what I've found when you do research on so many different characters, is that they were
mhm.
very actually emotional people.
Mm,
In fact, the 18th century, in some ways, was distinct from the, there's this sort of stereotype again of the British stiff upper lip, but I
mm,
feel like that hadn't really been an established thing in the 18th
yes.
century. You did
Yeah.
have the idea of stoicism, and I mean that in the strict sense of it, like actual
Mm,
classical stoicism, but
mhm.
not so much this notion that, for example, Brits by nature were
Yes.
kind of, holding it tight to the chest. It didn't seem
Mhm,
like that.
mhm,
And in fact, men, for example, would be way more affectionate with each other. They would
mhm,
be calling each other
mhm.
my dear. They would
Yeah.
be way more open to hugging and kissing, quite frankly. They were
Yeah.
different in their way of showing
Mhm.
affection to
Yeah.
one another. And they were different in their way of expressing themselves in
Mhm,
speeches and letters and everything else. They were
mhm.
very, so you get this sense of they're very oftentimes very warm-blooded
Mm,
individuals.
mhm.
And when you think about both the Americans and the British, who are their parents, it's like they
Yeah.
have the same cultural, majority of them have the same cultural
Mm,
tap roots here of,
mm,
Anglo-Saxon connection, if you will. I
mhm.
mean, it makes total sense if you go back, and my kind of original hobby horse is the medieval period and early
Oh.
medieval.
Mm,
Um, when you look back upon, for example, the origins of the English people, you're starting with, well, you're starting with Celts, but then you get,
yeah.
the Germanic tribes, which everyone,
Mhm.
are calling like the sea wolves, and they're these really
Mm,
fierce and fiery people who you get
mm,
missionaries don't want to go to them because they say
mhm.
they're crazy. They're
Yeah.
very passionate individuals, and then you get the Normans, who are a
Mm,
mixture of French and Scandinavian, and I'm just like,
mhm,
yeah, how we suddenly get this concoction of peoples to make the English people, and then you ultimately get the wider British
mm,
people with the Welsh and the Scottish, etc. And
mm.
I'm just sort of like, yeah, and we expect them to be stiff upper lip to the extent,
Yeah.
no, it doesn't even make sense. I think that's a modern. I think it really is like a
It is.
modern thing that sort of developed both in popular conception and
Mhm,
just in the way certain things within modern British culture went, but
mhm,
it's not actually a
mhm,
traditional thing. And so in the
mhm,
case of the 18th century, when we're dealing with,
mm.
whether it's George Washington, who of course fundamentally was British,
Yes.
by ancestry and everything else,
Mhm,
and all of these other characters, it's like, well, no, yeah, they them being emotional, passionate, fiery people
mm,
makes sense, and you
mhm,
can just feel it really through the speeches and the
mm.
writings of them in the time
Yes.
period.
Yes, for sure.
Um,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think of there's the popular slogan that people think of with England, and it's keep calm and carry on.
Yes.
And I think that really was the start of our our modern society considering British people as stoic and as emotionless. Because I don't even think stoicism is, something that's emotionless. I think it's a
No.
strength throughout emotion, and being able to carry yourself through something difficult, even while you're experiencing the emotions. But as far as believing that, they have like the stiff upper lip, I think that came from that phrase being popular, but ironically, it was originally created to be used during World War II,
Right.
to encourage the British community throughout the bombings and throughout the war with Germany. But it actually was never used.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things also that may have started up was in later Victorian Edwardian culture.
Yeah.
Although again, even that was very different, I think, than what because the Victorians and the Edwardians could actually be pretty emotionally. You know,
Yeah.
you read some of their writings, it's like, yeah, these people were not exactly stilted. They were not stilted in their emotional flow of things, but you get the impression that, however, the sort of idea of the stern and silent pride that you see in like Land of Hope and Glory being referenced and stuff like that. You can feel that in the latter Victorian period and the Edwardian period, there starts to be an emphasis on this as a trait that's very much a British trait. Whereas I feel like back in the 18th century, you do have, if anything, you have the notion that there's a wonderful line actually, which is on the marker of Lord George Augustus Howe, who was killed during the French and Indian War. And it says, if nothing else, an Englishman is brave, and which I do love. But it also is something that, I mean, I think that it is a distinct thing, though, from if nothing else, an Englishman is a robot, or if nothing else, an Englishman has no emotion. It's not that. I mean, Lord George, for example, was a very, very vibrant guy, like very, very full of life, to the extent that when he was killed, that was one of the factors that the swiftness of his death shocked people because of it. But I think really the key of now I think about it, it kind of ties back into the story you're telling with the whole if nothing else, an Englishman is brave. We think about Major André, and that was kind of, you get kind of a summary of some of his last words that he was speaking on the gallows. You bear witness that I die a brave man, and all of that.
Exactly.
So there was this I think ancestral honor code, that either they were believing that they were inheriting, like in the case of Howe, that you carry on something, or in the case of Andre, something you're adopting, because of course his family was French Huguenot in ancestry, and so he is actually, I find one of the elements of his story is actually quite moving, is that he's himself is figuring out how to actually become British in a way, in the sense of to really embody in a particular way the country, that he, in many cases, I mean, when you think about it, he's become a very well, at least among, again, I mean, not that famous, but among American Revolution fans and among people within that era, certainly in that era, he's become this martyr for king and country, if you will, become a symbol of Britain through everything that went down. But he was the first generation to be British in his family. So that in of itself is sort of it's just an interesting element. It's a sort of an inspirational element in its own way, how one could embody something that is not necessarily, something that goes back to the beginning of one's ancestry many generations back, but it's something that can be assumed, if you will, and made real within one's own life. And so that's an interesting aspect. So how did you get interested in the characters that you wrote about, whether it's Major Andre, Ben Tallmadge, and others? What drew you to them, and how did you go about exploring their stories, researching them, and bringing them to life?
Yeah. I think it was Benjamin Tallmadge who really, he was the one who just drew me in.
Yes.
And I think secondary to that, it is John Andre. And it all started when I saw the TV show Turn. And a lot of revolutionary fans have heard of that show. They love it. And I think that just kind of opened up everyone's eyes to the fact that George Washington did have a spy ring during the Revolutionary War, and that it did take a lot of espionage to change the course of the war. And we think so often of these brave rebels out in the open fighting the British, yet there was so much going on behind the scenes. And so that really intrigues me, and especially the fact that so many of the Culper spy ring, which is the ring that worked for George Washington, so many of them were childhood friends and were part of the same community, grew up together. And so there was just an element of that was really fascinating to me. So from there, I read the book that inspired Turn, which is George Washington's Secret Six. And that just, really fed my hunger and my curiosity. So from there, I started reading more firsthand sources, including Major Tallmadge's biography, and it's titled Benjamin Tallmadge's Memoirs. And his son encouraged him to write it after the war, years after the war. And he didn't even mention his involvement as the youngest intelligence officer. So he, kind of kept that secret. He would make little hints towards it. But, people didn't understand his involvement until much longer. Exactly. So yeah, there was just elements, his bravery, his honor, just the strength of his character. And he was very noble, very caring, very humble, incredibly intelligent. And he also had a very strong faith. And just that, combination just really fascinated me and inspired me. And then from there, just learning about John André and learning about his family and just thinking, he has this family back in England, and he has these sisters and this younger brother. And, here he is, a young British officer, and he's trying to make a way for himself, make a way for his family, so differently than how the rebels are trying to do the same thing. And just the tragedy of his story was really fascinating too. So I think just all of that kind of came together and just ended up sparking the question of, we know there's this unknown woman who was pivotal in the spy ring. And we know she was connected to British society because she got some pretty high up intelligence that you couldn't get without, being an insider. And so it just sparked the question, the good old what if? And I asked, what if it was Andre's sister? Asking that question just started the story.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And what you said about Talmadge, it was interesting too about the fact that his faith background, and I know that he was friends and possibly roommates with Nathan Hale
Yes.
at college, and and Nathan Hale's another figure who had quite a religious faith. And I mean, I think a lot of times this sort of thing does get overlooked or underrated or skipped. That most people on both sides of the war were on some level or other religious, because it was a religious age. Now, you did have Enlightenment deism going on, but frankly, deism isn't atheism anyway. I notice people tend to conflate weirdly, but I mean, deism is honestly the opposite of atheism, in the sense that it's believing in a deity, even if it's somewhat different or more influenced by classical paganism than by traditional Christianity, but it still is, and it still was, for that matter, usually a bit of a mix. So you had lots of people who, might be calling themselves deists, but on some level they also were Anglican, or however the kind of meshes. It's a bit like how there was a lot of gray area with regards to being a member of the Masons, for example,
Mm,
which was extremely common in the time period,
mhm,
and yet also being a member of your church, and sometimes that
mm,
would overlap and overlay in different ways. But
mhm,
people, were more religious.
mhm,
By and large, atheism was very, very rare.
mhm,
And the idea of not acknowledging, at the very least, a creator, who
mm,
on some level has an overarching design for things,
mm,
was just really not accepted, not only just accepted as like a socially acceptable thing, but it also was
yeah,
considered deeply unintelligent to deny that
mm,
there was some kind of a
mhm,
greater intelligence.
yeah,
So that kind of thing is fascinating. I mean, as you say, when you're looking at people like Talmadge and
mm,
Hale and what they
mhm,
put into their biographies, but also when you
mhm,
look at the André family, because again, they're
mhm,
Huguenots. They
mhm,
are religious refugees from
yeah,
France who settle
mhm,
in Britain to make a new life for themselves, and
mhm,
expand themselves in the mercantile endeavors
mm,
and so forth, and to
mhm,
be part of the sort of growing middle class,
mm,
which is what they are is and I noticed some people falsely assume that Andre was an aristocrat.
mm,
Which he had plenty of friends who were aristocrats, but
mhm,
he was middle class, and
mhm,
was just sort of getting, rubbing elbows with
mm,
those of a
mhm,
higher station, and so on and so forth. But really, he comes from this interesting, you know, um, Calvinist background. Um,
mm,
but my friend and coworker,
mm,
Leah Fisher, who's going to be editing this,
mm.
we have a running joke with each other about
Oh, yeah.
hard-headed Calvinists. But
Mm,
hard-headed Calvinists, um, because she's writing a historical fiction book,
mm.
set during loosely the World War II period,
Oh,
and
mhm,
dealing with a character who actually was involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler, who was
mm,
the brother-in-law of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, basically.
mm.
And
Oh,
he,
wow.
Hans, was called by another character a hard-headed Calvinist, and so we have this running
Mm.
joke. But
Yeah.
I think it is true that the background of Andre continued to affect him throughout his life. I've
Mm,
read various different accounts
mhm,
of things that demonstrate that even though he got involved in party life and party
mm,
lifestyle,
mhm,
he remained a Christian.
mhm,
Fundamentally, he remained influenced by his Huguenot upbringing.
mhm, mhm,
There's one anecdote that's told involving several uh, teenagers, around 14 or 15, who were
mm,
captured during, a sort of a skirmish type
mm,
engagement,
mhm,
outside of New York, many such
mm.
situations,
Oh, yeah.
and ended up being brought to New York, and were going to be put on a prison hulk,
Mhm.
and that's not going to be a great fate. Your
No.
percentage of survival on prison hulks, but actually prisoner of war camps in general in this time
Mhm,
period, or prisons in general, was pretty
mhm.
nil.
Yeah.
So one of the kids starts to panic and have a kind
Mm,
of a panic attack
mm,
meltdown. And it so happened, according to his account, that
mm,
somebody had come by and asked him, basically asked after him, asked what he was panicking, and he says, "I'm
mm,
never going to see my family again." And this an anonymous British officer sort of takes him by the hand and says, "Calm down, be manly, but don't cry. I'll." And then he says to the guard, like, "Don't touch him till I've come back." So the
mm.
kid asks, "Who the heck was that?"
Yeah.
And he says, "You thank your lucky stars. Thank your lucky stars. That was Major Andre, and he's probably gone to beg you off, like he's done with quite a few of your rebel kind."
Wow. Mm,
So he did so. He did go and he pulled the strings and he begged them off. And he
mm,
essentially said, "So okay, kids, what essentially is happening now is that you've been turned over to my authority, so I could do
mm,
what I want. So what I want is for you to run away.
Yeah.
So he said, please disappear.
Yes.
So he says this, but what's particularly noteworthy to rope right back to the point of religion is that he says to them, according to the kids' report of this event, that, and this is when the kid is grown up, he's giving legally is what happened. He basically says that André effectively told him, go home to your parents, be good children to them, love your parents, obey your parents, love one another, say your prayers, go home, fear God, God will bless you, go. And so it does indicate, again, even though he got into party life, he did care about his faith in the end. And in the end, they also have a story that he had a hymn that mistakenly sometimes gets said that he wrote the hymn, but actually what it was a pre-existing hymn, but he clearly had it memorized enough to have written it in his hand. It's called Hail Sovereign Love, that first began the scheme to rescue fallen man, hail matchless free eternal grace that gave my soul a hiding place. So clearly, point being, the age was infused with religious faith. Many characters within it had this religious faith, and it's something that mattered to them. And I think that in the modern period often gets scrubbed out of the narratives, and that's an unfortunate thing. And I think it makes it a much weaker telling for the lack of these elements.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, we even look at, Hamilton, the musical, and, that as wonderful a work as it is, it's so unique. There's so much that was left out as far as how important and crucial faith was and is, and how our country couldn't exist without it. And you have this beautiful song. It's one of my favorites in Hamilton the musical, but it quotes some of George Washington's own letters when he retires from the presidency. And he himself quoted scripture, and he spoke of how he wanted to rest under his own vine and fig tree. And just this thought of, I have fought the fight, I've run the race, and it's my time to rest in the Lord. And so, I think, understanding how pivotal faith was to these people at that time, and how pivotal it is to us now as well, is really something that we don't want to overlook.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is true of the writing process itself. I mean, I don't know about you, and I mean, I guess this is an interesting question to even think about, but like for me, there's a spiritual component to the writing process in terms of really especially when doing historical fiction, I think, because you're dealing with people who are real, who, really shared, this, time and space, if you will, continuum with us. And there's a sense of being in time, out of time when you're doing that kind of thing, when you're researching characters and you're trying to really inhabit the space they inhabited in some ways. There's got to be a sense of kind of reverence to that, and a sense of, when one is religiously minded, there's a sense of God being present to that process of creation. Because like, even there's the level of kind of communing with the souls that have gone by in some way, but also the sense of like what Tolkien talked about with regards to subcreating. And that's like a really big thing, what we do with F&F, because it's all about kind of that idea is the idea behind it. So like, how is that for you, I suppose, like in the writing process and the creating process? What do you kind of bring to it in terms of just your philosophy of it?
Yeah, for sure. I love that we're discussing this. It's something I've always like wanted to discuss. I mean, I remember when I was first writing A Lady, and the second book, A Spy, that was about like 5-6 years ago. I remember discussing with a friend, what my experience in, the trenches of writing this story was. And I remember saying it really is a spiritual experience. And it's an incredible way to encounter God and his presence. And, I mentioned in the acknowledgments in my book, that glory goes to the ultimate storyteller. And, that's our Father, that's God. And, he created the story, which is, the past, present, and future. He created the gospel, which is a story of, his love for humanity. And even you look at Jesus when he was on earth and, he was working his ministry, he used stories to connect with those who were listening. And so I think, all of that is just undeniable evidence that God is just all over stories, all over creativity, all over expressing ourselves, and taking what we have and making it into something that can impact others. And I think he really is the only one who can be truly original. And so we're only able to take what he has and create with that.
Sure.
But
And
what a
it's kind of the
blessing.
notion of sub-creating as well, that we're kind of, there's the
Exactly.
overarching, and then we all have our fractured element of truth that we're bringing to the table, if you will. And
Mhm.
but yeah, I mean, we all, and you're right, like no one can be 100% original, and I think that that's probably a good thing, because
Mm.
being, I suppose, involved in the work of storytelling involves a kind of a communal process,
Mm.
where on some level there are some things that work within stories because they're
Mhm.
universal. There's
Yes.
universal themes that kind of weave
Mhm.
themselves into
Mhm.
stories, and weave themselves
Mhm.
into characters, and why we're drawn to
Mhm.
given stories and given characters. So I think that yeah, that is something that I think is just kind of again a universal when you look at
Mm.
human history, even like what
Mhm.
was, kind of all the way back to like the earliest things we
Mm.
see, language that formed through imagery, and
Yes.
that sort of told stories, that's
Mhm.
yet the ancient myths and everything else, but the ancient,
Mm.
it's something that is so fundamentally a part of us. One might almost say it comes to us almost with like the infusion of soul.
Mhm.
That's part
Mhm.
of, what it is. And it
Mm.
kind of goes back to that notion, like we were saying, back in the day, people would think you were mad to say that there wasn't some higher intelligence. And I think
Mhm.
storytelling is part of that,
Mhm.
that as
Mhm.
well, that kind of indication, if you will, something pointing towards God,
Mhm.
that is there. And
Mhm.
and I think that you know just makes us, richer people for it,
Mhm. Mhm.
to try and engage, even though when it feels like we're burning off like years of our lives sometimes in the process.
Yes.
Um, what for you was the hardest parts of the writing process, and the whole thing? What for you was the greatest sort of hurdle to overcome?
Mm. I think honestly, with the writing process, it really just flowed. I mean, it took me about a month to write both A Lady and a Spy. So,
A
now
month
it's
each
two
or a month
books.
for both?
A month for both. Yeah. So
Oh, really?
originally both books were just one book.
Hmm.
But since I continued working on it and refining it
Hmm.
for about 5 to 6 years, it ended up turning into a tome, as my publisher
Yeah.
put it. And so she was like, well, let's split it into two books.
Yeah.
But to write the original story, it took a month. And to circle back, it really was a spiritual experience of, the story just flowed and it just clicked. And somehow, the history and my imagination and the stories that were being breathed into life through me and in me were connecting
Hmm.
in such a miraculous way. But I think the challenges that I've faced and the hurdles I've had to overcome have come in the publishing process.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that has really, you know, tested my trust in God and my trust in myself and my trust in this story. And there have been times where it's been an incredibly vulnerable process of you've put so much heart and soul and so much of yourself into this book.
Absolutely.
Your thoughts, your experiences, all of that just bleeds into your story, and that's what makes it so special and so impactful. But at the same way, it can make it equally impactful, sometimes in a negative way, when you get particularly harsh feedback. And I remember reaching out to some endorsers, some other authors, to have them support my book. And some of them, it was just a difference of taste. It was a difference of perspective. Some said I misinterpreted certain characters in areas where there's actually not much known about those certain aspects of those characters. So it really is up to interpretation. I had one person say that my book was too violent when it came to war scenes, which I found a little ironic because it's war. War is violent. And I think if anything, I did tone it down for audiences compared to some firsthand accounts that I read of what those battles actually were like. And so I think, if anything, I made it a little easier for audiences to swallow.
I think it's always tricky with regards to people's tastes and regarding like rating systems and things. Like I've struggled with this myself. What would you say, by the way, is the age range that you're aiming at with your books? Or is there one, or is it kind of general?
Yeah. So it's within the category of new adult, which that category pretty much starts with like late high school, early college, and up. So it's not young adult fiction, just because it does have, more intense war scenes. It has some, deeper topics of, death and that sort of thing. So it is something, for a little more mature audiences. But yeah, it's, I don't know what else I was going to say with that.
Yeah. I mean, this is, something I experienced when I released my first novel, which was a Robin Hood retelling, Saplings of Sherwood. They basically make you on Amazon select an age rating when you're doing uploading. And so I was like, well, it was a weird kind of system, because for me, I didn't think that, like, I wanted to do, my estimation would have been 15 plus, because I felt like it was right as a middle mark, because my material does deal, as you say, with certain mature themes as well, with certain violent aspects. I mean, you're dealing in that case with the aftermath of the Norman conquest. It was a pretty brutal time. Stuff went down, and I was trying to depict that authentically. So I knew it wasn't going to be a children's book, and I knew it wasn't going to be suitable, and I knew it was going to, at least probably be at about a 15 mark in terms of maturity. But at the same time, they made you want to go to like 16 or 17, and then the problem was, once they started doing that, there was a tendency for those types of books to be the sort of erotica books, the porn books. And so, like, I was just kind of like, I don't want everyone to think that that's what this is. And so it's really weird, like with the rating systems. I'm not a fan of them because of that. I think they're very unclear in terms of what you're rating what for. And what even, I suppose the thing is that there's so much out there when you look at kind of the Game of Thrones phenomena that is just gratuitous in terms of sex and violence. But what's happened, however, is that then it can almost create a backlash where the only type of, I suppose, alternative fiction is material where they don't touch themes of violence or sexuality at all. And that's not really even, I don't think it's even good for the Christian community to avoid it altogether, because we need to be able to have commentary on these
I
topics.
agree. Mm-hmm.
So therefore there needs to be a balance, I think, within that kind of fiction
Mm-hmm.
sphere. But the
Mm-hmm.
rating, as you say, the ratings are
Yeah.
very tricky in terms
Mm-hmm.
of that type of thing. But yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, having read your work, I would say, roughly speaking, it is similar to my
Mm.
rating.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
generally that.
Mm.
But yeah, no, it is interesting, and I mean, again, the taking of war accounts and
Mm.
trying to kind of put them into a fictional version of events, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
a
Mm-hmm.
fictional, it does require that kind of walking a line to try to figure
Mm-hmm.
out how much you want to put in, how
Mm-hmm.
realistic down to the wire you want to
Mm-hmm.
be, in terms of just the realities of war
Mm-hmm.
and violence and everything that kind of went with it.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think the point of it is, which again I think is something that's important, because there's a lot of pointless gratuity out there, which has no, like, in other words,
Yeah.
in a lot of books and TV, and there's
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't have any kind of real wider merit to the
Yes.
story. It simply is there for shock factor, and the idea, I
Mm-hmm.
think, is to try and figure out how to integrate certain
Mm.
authentic elements that are just part of the history in a
Mm-hmm.
way that isn't there to titillate.
Yeah.
It's there to actually
Mm-hmm.
draw compassion, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
something that's very, very important when doing
Mm-hmm.
storytelling, is to do, that kind of thing, that you want to
Mm-hmm.
draw compassion, and you want to make people feel, for
Mm-hmm.
the characters,
Yeah.
and you would hope that they start to view those characters as real people, just as
Mm-hmm.
real as, um and as people they would know, I suppose, in real
Mm-hmm.
life.
Mm-hmm.
So actually that ties in. So what, when you were doing the writing, like, who among the characters for you did you kind of graft to most, or feel the most comfortable, or feel as if that character was most real to you in the process?
Mm-hmm. I say it's a mixture of Mary André, the main character, and then Benjamin Tallmadge.
Mhm.
I really um just related to each of them in so many different ways, and yet there were definitely aspects where it was like, okay, this is true to who Major Talmadge was, and maybe not something that I can relate to,
Mhm.
but is paying respect to the history. And
Mhm.
then for Mary Andre, just allowing her to be the character she was developing into. And I think, to give an example, Mary Andre is just incredibly curious, which I have a similar curiosity, and
Mhm.
that really is what drives my writing. Is I want to know, I want to understand, I want to experience, and then I want to share what I learn with others. But I think Mary has a element of immaturity to it, and almost a brashness, where she just runs into situations and then has to think on her feet. And I'm definitely more of the type who wants to kind of think things through and
Mhm.
then proceed. So yeah, so I think it was great to find elements that I could connect to, while also, allowing them to be their own characters as well.
Characters.
Hmm.
Did you have any particular scenes, either in A Lady or a Spy, that you remember taking particular pleasure in writing, or that you feel, I guess, you feel particularly proud of, as far as
Hmm.
like the execution, how it turned out? I use execution not as a pun, actually, but anyway, any sequences that you, yes, you felt particularly proud of or pleased with, that you wrote.
Yeah. I think a little bit of a spoiler. It's in A Spy. And I'll try to tread
Try
carefully
to
with this. I
do
don't
it
want
in
to
a way
spoil it
that's,
too
yeah.
much. But it has to do with Mary Andre and her love story with Major Tallmadge. And, that's something that those who have read A Lady already are very seriously invested in. I've gotten like a lot of requests of like, when do we get the next book?
Yeah.
But yeah, essentially the subject that's dealt with is the temptation for intimacy that as a believer is supposed to be reserved for marriage. And that's something that, like you said, you either see it in a very meaninless, pointless, just for the shock factor. You see it in that context where there's just, overly sexual content and that sort of thing. Or you see the complete opposite where it's just completely ignored.
Right.
And, for me as a young woman and, just growing up and, just all the questions you face in life. And then, I'm married now. And so having that different perspective too, there were a lot of questions that I had and a lot of perspectives that I wanted to explore that I didn't really think was being addressed or expressed in either of those parties, that either exposed too much of
Right.
sexual content or not any at all. And so with Mary and Major Tallmadge, they come to this point where, they're faced with the temptation because of how intense their care for each other is and how deep their relationship has become. And they're faced with the option of, we could proceed in this course, or we could choose to have the self-control that's offered to us, from our convictions from the Lord as well, to resist and to, preserve this as something for the right timing. And that was something that I wanted to explore and express to audiences that, this is an option. It's not something that has to be, it's not a topic we have to shy from or be all hush hush about. It's something we should discuss, but discuss how can we view and approach sex and that whole topic in a way that is biblical and godly and that is healthy.
Holistic to kind of the human, holistic to the human experience as well.
Exactly.
Which is, I think that, in a way that's true of every aspect of writing, really. You're trying to get kind of a holistic sense that you don't want any one element to overly dominate another, whether, in dealing with trying to, put together pieces really of a thing, whether it's, the idea of trying to layer war and romance and, intrigue kind of elements and personal exploration, and it can be interesting and tricky at times. And I know that like so in my trilogy that I'm working on now, Major Andre does show up. He shows up in book 3. So he's coming down the pike. But with some mild spoilers, basically the way that he enters into the story, and again trying to integrate, because originally I didn't know how to include Andre in the story, to be honest. I really badly wanted to, because I just thought I will have a blast. I will have such a blast trying to do this character, because I had long been into him because he is the artsy type. And I'm an artsy type. So it was just like, all right, we can have some fun here. So I badly wanted to do that, but I wasn't exactly sure how to include him, in the timeline, because the main bulk of the story is focused on the Saratoga campaign. And so I wasn't sure regarding how to make that, shift, but I managed to find a way by sending one of the characters to Philly. So basically,
Mhm.
what ends up happening, we do finally we get to André, and then it was a matter of trying to integrate these elements because I wanted to do something different than, they have a lot of focus on his last like year of life in
Mhm.
stories. And I
Mhm.
kind of wanted to do something where actually we never see him die in this particular
Mm.
variation. So this is
Mhm.
very much not, yeah, it's him in a different sort of light sphere, but
Mhm.
still with some elements. So for example, you have the main character Ned run into him down in Philly, and they essentially start hanging out in the British social scene. But
Mm.
ultimately, you kind of get the vibe that Andre thinks Ned could be a spy, so is trying to keep
Uh-huh.
an eye on him. And there's this whole sort of tension in the friendship, which is actually
Mm.
building.
Mhm.
And we do get a lot of time to kind of explore personality types and backgrounds and so on
Mm.
and so forth, but with this caveat that there is an underlying element that he's a professional with a job to try to, root out people who,
Mm.
could be leaking information like a sieve.
Mhm.
So there's a kind of a balance between
Mhm.
sort of Andre, his personal life, and Andre and his professional life, and,
Yes.
and all of these other elements going on, as we talked about his Huguenot background versus Ned, the main
Mm.
character's Catholic background, is going to cause
Mm.
some tensions because, of course, the Huguenots were persecuted by Catholics in France, but by
Mm.
contrast, the Catholics in England are persecuted by the Anglicans. So there's all of this going on. So
Mhm.
basically, the fact that the two of them find themselves together, it brings
Mhm.
up the question of whether Andre is going to handle the situation more based on his feelings about the way his family was treated,
Mm.
and whether those feelings are going to lean towards him reacting in a very negative way toward Ned, or
Mm.
because he understands what it's like to deal with persecution, to
Mm.
act in a more compassionate, merciful way. So that's kind of the
Mm.
main premise of that.
Mhm.
But I did, in the process of doing that, there is the question of balancing all of this. So trying to
Mhm.
balance it in terms of the
Mhm.
characterization, trying
Mhm.
to really lean into finding a voice for the character,
Mm.
finding and making that character feel as real as possible. Um,
Yeah.
and then trying to balance off the different layers of the character and the different layers of the interactions and everything else. And that does require quite a lot of brain power, really, to the point
Mm.
where you do feel drained by
Yeah.
it, because it's like there's so many different layers you're trying to get right, and you feel like if
Mhm.
one layer or another isn't laid out quite right, it's going to
Mm.
destabilize it and feel just sort of
Mm.
off.
Mhm.
So yeah, it definitely is. I think that the balancing line is one of those things that is difficult for all authors to tread, to integrate, and so
Mm.
forth.
Mhm.
So did you get any particular reviews for your work that you were particularly proud of, or were particularly pleased to receive, or even that actually were difficult to get, but then when you got them, you were pleased about it? What was
Mhm.
like your kind of happiest, I guess, moment with regards to that kind of thing?
Yeah. Yeah, and just a heads up, this will need to be the last
Sure,
question.
that was actually
So
my
I need to,
plan. So
yeah, I need to get the cat dinner and all that.
no worries.
Um,
The kitty must eat. So yes,
right.
go right ahead.
Yeah. I got so many wonderful endorsements and such great feedback, and it all, has really meant so much. There's incredible authors such as Tosca Lee. She's a New York Times bestselling author, and she had, a lot of great praise. There's also Laura France, and she is pretty, widely enjoyed
I'm
in
actually
historical
listening to her.
fiction.
I'm actually listening to her book, The Least
Oh, nice.
Maker, on audio right now.
Yes,
So
I read that one. It was so good.
okay.
Yes.
She's very descriptive. She has a very
Yeah.
like nice descriptive.
Very detail oriented. I love it. And she's just a very sweet person too. Been very
Yes,
supportive of my
I spoke
release.
to her briefly, and
Um,
she was very much
oh,
so.
good.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. I also, I think what I learned in the marketing and endorsing process was, it never hurts to ask. And I've ended up having some wonderful collaborations just by, going out on a limb and asking people. And there was a book about early American colonial history by Alan Taylor. And he's a well-known historian, Pulitzer Prize winning. And I reached out to him and was like, well, by chance, could you read my book? He said he's actually currently teaching a class on historical fiction. And he endorsed my book. He really enjoyed it. So that was great to hear as well, especially since, it has, this strong romantic story to it. But it also is a book that I want both male and female audiences to connect with. So, having a clouded historian and also a male enjoy my book was a huge relief.
Gratifying, yeah.
Yes. And then I think another piece of feedback just from an early reader that was really encouraging was that she has difficulty reading books, and she, just with her attention span and just how busy life is, she, has a challenge in just sitting down and focusing on the book and just reading through it. And it takes her a long time to get through a book. And she got through my book in, I believe it was 3 days. And that was pretty much like record time for her. She said it was very easy to read, easy to connect to the history and understand it. Even though, she didn't really come from a historical fiction background of enjoying that sort of genre. So that really, it meant a lot that, there's a variety of audiences that have been able to connect to through this story. So that's been just, so encouraging. You want this book and this story to bless others. And so hearing that it has that effect is incredibly gratifying.
Absolutely. And yeah, I agree that having read the book, it is, I want to say an easy read in the sense of it's easy to get through in good time. So it doesn't feel heavy where you're like having to cut through it with a knife as it will. So that so I definitely agree with her on that point that it has that kind of you can get through. I think I finished it in like maybe 2 days as well.
Oh wow.
So that I can definitely and same thing with A Spy as well. So I think that
thank you.
Absolutely. So feel free before we close out to pitch yourself where this book can be found, any of your other social media or projects you're doing upcoming. So have the air.
Yes, for sure. So you can find me by my author name, which is Hannah Honegger, on most social media. I'm mainly on Instagram.
You want to spell that?
Yes. So Hannah is the palindrome HANNAH, and then Honegger is HONEGGER. And I can mostly be found on Instagram, also on Facebook, a little bit on TikTok. My publisher is Quill and Flame Publishing House. They're a small publishing house, and they focus mainly on incredibly impactful stories that you can trust aren't going to have some of those sexual and violent surprises that a lot of stories do have. Their motto is heat without a scorch. So I think that really encapsulates their mission of, having those powerful stories that do deal with some gritty subjects, but that, aren't damaging. I have the pleasure of working with them, and release date is July 4th. So it's coming up quick. Independence Day is perfect. And it's my birthday. Yes.
There we go. So,
exactly. A reason to celebrate. It'll be available on Amazon, anywhere books are sold. I'll be having some exciting book events coming up. So definitely connect on social media. And Yeah, I'm very excited.
Excellent. And do you have any other projects upcoming in terms of like other
Mm.
writing endeavors or any other novels in the works or anything like that?
Yeah. So the second installment of the Culper Spy Ring, the Culper 355 Cipher series, is a spy, and that is the second and final book in the series, and it comes out November 5th. Of this year, so closely
Gunpowder plot
following
then.
on the heels. Yes,
Yeah, there we go.
exactly. Yeah. And then after that, I'm working on a lot of different projects. I'm working with Aurora Creative Talent. They do screenplays, a lot of book adaptations into film. So hopefully I'll have some new projects with that continuing on. And then I have a trilogy set about the lost colony of Roanoke Island.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yes, so I have that I'm working on. Definitely excited about that one. And then, yeah, I have some other stories that are just brewing within me that are heavily inspired by Korea and K-dramas. As my husband's Korean, Korean culture is something I value. It's very dear to my heart. So definitely excited to explore some stories within that realm too.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Hannah, for
Thank
coming on.
you.
It was lovely talking to you about your projects. So nice to talk
You
to
as
someone else
well.
who shares kind of a general worldview about spirituality and creativity. So thank you so much for being on FNF, and
Yay.
we would love to have you back when you will release
Yes.
the second book and so forth, and hope that you do splendidly with
Thank
the release.
you. Thank you. It was wonderful chatting with you. I look forward to
Yes,
connecting again soon.
excellent. Thank you. You have a lovely day.